Julia felt the loneliness gnaw at her heart every night. Her husband, Michael, was distant, and the fights were constant. The once cozy home in New York had become a stage for endless arguments. Julia struggled to keep up appearances, but the pain ran deep. The little things like the absence of a good morning or the lack of a good-night kiss tore her apart. She remembered the times when Michael looked at her with love in his eyes, and now she saw only coldness. That night started like so many others. Julia was in the kitchen, mechanically preparing dinner while Michael was in his office, buried in work. The table was set, the candles lit, everything carefully planned to try to rekindle some of the lost romance. But the void between them was palpable. "Michael, dinner's ready," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. He appeared at the door, tired eyes and a distant look. They sat across from each other, but the silence was deafening. Julia tried to start a conversation, talking about the day, but every attempt was met with monosyllabic responses. Finally, the frustration exploded. "Why are you so distant? What happened to us?" Her voice trembled, loaded with pain and desperation. Michael let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples. "Julia, I'm tired. Work is killing me. We need this contract to keep the company running." She felt a wave of anger mixed with sadness. "It's not just work, Michael. You barely look at me. You barely talk to me. It's like I don't exist." Michael abruptly stood up, knocking over his chair. "I don't have time for this, Julia. Not now." And he left, leaving her alone in the dining room, tears rolling down her face. Julia sat there feeling completely helpless. Every night seemed to worsen, and she no longer knew how to fix what was broken. The moments of affection had become distant memories, replaced by a coldness that hurt deeply. She remembered the nights they spent together, laughing and making plans for the future. Where had everything gone wrong? How had their love turned into a silent war? Julia felt lost, as if she were sinking into an endless abyss. Later, in the dark bedroom, Julia lay alone, staring at the empty space beside her in bed. Michael had decided to sleep on the couch. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the weight of loneliness was unbearable. She hugged her pillow, crying silently until sleep finally took her. The next morning, with swollen eyes and an exhausted soul, Julia tried once more. "Michael, we need to talk. We can't go on like this." He looked at her, but his eyes were cold. "I have to go, I have an important meeting." And he left without looking back. Julia felt a sharp pang in her chest, a pain that spread throughout her body. She knew something was very wrong, but she didn't know how to fix it. Each passing day, the love of her life became a stranger, and the weight of this reality was crushing. Julia was determined not to give up, but the struggle seemed increasingly impossible. The pain and despair piled up, and she found herself more and more trapped in a web of sadness and loneliness. Every cold gesture from Michael was a stab to her heart, and she began to fear that the love that once united them was disintegrating forever. Weeks passed, and the tension between Julia and Michael only grew. Julia tried to maintain hope, but each day seemed worse than the previous one. Then on a rainy afternoon, the phone rang. It was Sarah, her childhood best friend. "Julia, I'm in town for a conference. I thought about spending a few days with you if it's not a bother." Julia, though surprised, felt a small spark of hope. "Of course, Sarah, it would be wonderful to see you." Maybe, she thought, the presence of an old friend could bring some relief. Sarah arrived at Julia's house the next day, bringing with her an aura of positive energy that seemed to have been missing for so long. With her captivating smile and the ease of making any environment seem lighter, Sarah soon won over everyone in the house, including Michael. They laughed, reminisced about school days, adventures, and the dreams they had when they were young. That first night, the three of them sat at the dinner table. Sarah told funny stories from her life, making Julia and Michael laugh. Julia felt lighter, as if she had momentarily regained a piece of her former happiness. Michael seemed more relaxed, less tense than he had been for weeks. However, Julia didn't notice the furtive glances Sarah threw at Michael, nor the smiles he returned. To Julia, it was just a relief to have someone who understood her. someone with whom she could vent and laugh again. But Sarah, beneath that friendly facade, had her own intentions. In the following days, Sarah integrated herself into the household routine. She helped Julia in the kitchen, accompanied her on walks, and gradually began to spend more time with Michael as well. One day, while Julia was busy with work, Sarah suggested to Michael that he join her for a morning run. He agreed, something Julia had been trying to convince him to do for months. During the run, Sarah took the opportunity to probe Michael about his relationship with Julia. "You seem so stressed, Michael. Is everything okay?" He sighed, feeling a relief to confide in someone other than Julia. "It's complicated, Sarah. The company is in crisis and Julia and I, well, we're not getting along." Sarah, with a sympathetic look, replied, "I understand. Sometimes we need someone to listen, someone who isn't directly involved." Sarah's words seemed to echo in Michael's mind. He felt drawn to her understanding, the way she made him feel heard and important. Sarah, sensing the opening, began to get closer. Small touches on the arm, shared laughter, prolonged glances. Each gesture was calculated, and Michael, though initially hesitant, began to give in. Julia, still unaware of what was unfolding, was pleased to see Michael more relaxed and engaged. She attributed it to Sarah's presence, not realizing that the remedy was becoming poison. The nights were more peaceful, and Julia began to believe that things could get better. But the truth was that behind Sarah's friendly smile was a calculated plan. While Julia fought to rebuild her marriage, Sarah was silently planting seeds of discord. She became Michael's confidant, listening to his complaints and offering advice that slowly drove him away from Julia. The conversations between Michael and Sarah became more intimate. He began to confide his fears and frustrations, and Sarah was always there, ready to offer a friendly shoulder. Julia, occupied with her own problems, didn't realize that her childhood friend was slowly becoming something more to her husband. Sarah moved with almost surgical precision, knowing exactly when to intervene and when to retreat. She knew Michael's trust was building, and with each passing day, he moved further away from Julia and closer to her. Sarah prepared for the next step, aware that Julia suspected nothing. The tension at home seemed to ease with Sarah's arrival. Julia felt grateful for her childhood friend's presence, who seemed to bring a breath of fresh air to the heavy atmosphere. Sarah was always smiling, always helpful, and Julia trusted her blindly. To Julia, Sarah was the same loyal friend as always, without a hint of malice. One afternoon, when Julia returned from work earlier than usual, she found Sarah and Michael in the living room, laughing and sharing a glass of wine. "Julia, you're home early," exclaimed Sarah with a radiant smile. "Yes, I finished early today," Julia replied, relieved to see Michael relaxed and chatting. Michael approached to give her a kiss on the forehead, a gesture he hadn't made in a long time. "Join us, love. Sarah was telling us about an amazing trip she took recently." Julia sat next to Michael, feeling warmed by the familiarity of the scene. Sarah and Michael continued talking, and Julia felt part of that moment of joy. The laughter that echoed in the room brought a sense of normalcy that she hadn't experienced in a long time. In the following days, Sarah became a constant presence. She helped Julia in the kitchen, accompanied her on walks, and spent more time with Michael, always with the excuse of wanting to help. "I'm here for you, Julia. I want you two to be happy together again," Sarah would say, and Julia fully believed her. One morning, while having coffee, Sarah suggested to Michael that he join her for a morning run. "It'll do you good, Michael, and you can vent a little. Julia told me you've been stressed," she said with an encouraging smile. Michael, initially reluctant, eventually agreed. For Julia, it was a relief to see that Michael was trying to relax and open up. "Thank you, Sarah. You're doing more for us than you realize," said Julia, hugging her friend. During the run, Sarah took the opportunity to probe Michael about his relationship with Julia. "You seem so stressed, Michael. Is everything okay?" He sighed, feeling at ease to confide in someone who seemed so understanding. "It's complicated, Sarah. The company is killing me and Julia and I, well, we're facing difficulties." Sarah looked at him with empathy. "I understand. Sometimes we need someone to listen, someone outside the situation. Sarah's words seemed to echo in Michael's mind. He felt drawn to her understanding, the way she made him feel heard and important. Sarah, sensing the opening, began to get closer. Small touches on the arm, shared laughter, prolonged glances. Each gesture was calculated, and Michael, though initially hesitant, began to give in. Julia, still unaware of what was unfolding, was pleased to see Michael more relaxed and her friend so present. She attributed it to Sarah's presence, not realizing that the remedy was becoming poison. The nights were more peaceful, and Julia began to believe that things could get better. But the truth was that behind Sarah's friendly smile was a calculated plan. While Julia fought to rebuild her marriage, Sarah was silently planting seeds of discord. She became Michael's confidant, listening to his complaints and offering advice that slowly drove him away from Julia. The conversations between Michael and Sarah became more intimate. He began to confide his fears and frustrations, and Sarah was always there, ready to offer a friendly shoulder. Julia, occupied with her own problems, didn't realize that her childhood friend was slowly becoming something more to her husband. Sarah moved with almost surgical precision, knowing exactly when to intervene and when to retreat. She knew Michael's trust was building, and with each passing day, he moved further away from Julia and closer to her. Sarah prepared for the next step, aware that Julia suspected nothing. While the friendship with Sarah seemed to ease the tension at home, the problems at Julia's family company were intensifying. Her older brother, Peter, managed the finances, but Julia began to notice irregularities. Figures didn't add up, transactions weren't explained. The company, which was their parents' legacy, was at risk, and this increased the pressure on Julia. One night, after Sarah and Michael had gone to bed, Julia stayed in the office reviewing financial reports. Her eyes were tired, her head ached. Each line of numbers was a puzzle, a mystery she couldn't solve. Frustrated, she called Peter. "Peter, we need to talk. Something's not right with the finances." On the other end of the line, Peter's voice was tense. "Julia, it's late. Can we talk about this tomorrow?" "No, Peter. This can't wait. I'm seeing discrepancies, transactions that don't make sense. What's going on?" Peter arrived at Julia's house a few minutes later. He was visibly nervous. "Julia, you're overreacting. Things are complicated, but I've got everything under control." "You have everything under control? How can you say that? We're losing money, Peter. This isn't normal." Peter rubbed his face with his hands, sighing heavily. "Okay, there are problems. I made some bad decisions, but I'm trying to fix it." Julia looked at her brother, feeling a mix of anger and despair. "Bad decisions? You're putting the company at risk, our family at risk." Peter approached, trying to calm the situation. "Julia, trust me. I'll resolve this. I just need time." "Time? We don't have time. You need to tell me the truth now, Peter. What's really going on?" The confession came slowly, with Peter revealing that he had gotten involved in schemes to try to save the company from imminent bankruptcy. Julia felt as if the ground were opening beneath her feet. The company, her parents' legacy, was on the brink of collapse, and her own brother was responsible. With tears in her eyes, Julia faced Peter. "How could you do this? We were supposed to be in this together, but you betrayed us." Peter tried to justify himself, but his words seemed empty. "I was trying to save the company, Julia. I did what I thought I had to do." Julia couldn't hold back the tears. "You lied to me, put us at risk. How can I ever trust you again?" Peter left, leaving Julia alone in the office. She sat at the desk, tears falling on the papers. The pain of her brother's betrayal added to the suffering she was already experiencing with Michael and Sarah. It was a burden too heavy to bear. That night, Julia lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Michael's face, Sarah's voice, Peter's lies. Everything blended into a whirlwind of pain and anguish. She felt suffocated, trapped in a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. The next morning, Julia went to the company with renewed determination. She needed to resolve the financial problems, face the consequences of Peter's actions. She knew it would be a tough battle, but she had no other choice. The company was her family's legacy, and she wouldn't let everything fall apart. While fighting to save the company, Julia also tried to maintain peace at home. Sarah and Michael remained close, and with each passing day, Julia felt more isolated. The tension between her professional and personal worlds was overwhelming. One afternoon, after a tense meeting at the company, Julia returned home exhausted. Sarah was in the kitchen preparing dinner and Michael was on the couch watching TV. "How was your day?" Sarah asked with a warm smile. Julia tried to smile back but couldn't hide her sadness. "It was tough. The company is facing serious problems." Sarah approached and hugged her. "I'm here to help, Julia. Count on me for whatever you need." Julia felt comforted, even if only for a moment. "Thank you, Sarah. You have no idea how much this means to me." While Sarah and Michael prepared dinner together, Julia watched from afar, trying to convince herself that everything was fine. She wanted to believe that Sarah was there to help, that Michael was just trying to relax. But the unease inside her didn't go away. She felt like a stranger in her own home, struggling to keep what was left of her life in order. Dinner was quiet, but Julia barely touched her food. Her mind was elsewhere, worried about the company, Michael. Each smile shared between Michael and Sarah was a reminder of the chasm forming between her and her husband. After dinner, Julia went to the bedroom, leaving Michael and Sarah talking in the living room. Julia woke the next morning with a heavy feeling in her chest. The worries about the company, the tension at home, and the growing closeness between Sarah and Michael made each day a battle. However, she had no idea that the worst was yet to come. While Julia was at work, fighting to fix Peter's financial mistakes, Sarah and Michael were planning the next step in their relationship. Sarah, always astute, knew she needed to remove the obstacles between her and Michael. And to do that, she began to plant the seed of a sinister plan. "Michael, you don't deserve all this pressure," Sarah said one quiet afternoon. They were in the garden, away from Julia's eyes. "You need a new life, away from all these problems." Michael sighed, tired. "I know, Sarah. But how? I can't just abandon everything." Sarah looked at him intently. "What if you could? What if you could start over, without the company's problems, without all this pressure?" Michael frowned, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Sarah moved closer, lowering her voice. "You could fake your own death, Michael. Leave everything behind. We could run away together, start over somewhere else." Michael was shocked, but the idea began to take root in his mind. "Fake my death? That's crazy, Sarah." "No, it's our chance to be happy," Sarah insisted. "Think about it. No company, no pressure from Julia. Just us, living the life we've always wanted." In the following days, Sarah continued to work on Michael, presenting the plan with more details. She explained how they could forge documents, create a fake accident. Michael, though initially hesitant, began to be swayed by the idea. The allure of a life free of problems was irresistible. Meanwhile, Julia noticed small changes in Michael. He was more distracted, distant in a different way. When she tried to get closer, he shut down even more. Julia didn't know, but Michael was struggling internally with the decision to follow Sarah's plan. One night, Sarah confronted Michael. "We need to decide, Michael. Do you trust me?" Michael looked at her. His inner struggle reflected in his eyes. Yes, I trust you, Sarah. But this is so risky." Sarah held his hand, conveying confidence. "It will work. Trust me. It's our only chance." Michael finally gave in. "Okay, let's do it." The following days were filled with secret preparations. Sarah and Michael created a story, details about the fake accident they would stage. Every step was calculated, every detail planned. Julia, still preoccupied with the company's problems, suspected nothing. The night before the accident, Sarah and Michael had one last conversation. "Tomorrow everything will change," Sarah said, looking deeply into Michael's eyes. "Yes, tomorrow will be the beginning of a new life," he replied, though a shadow of doubt still lingered over him. The next day, Michael left for a business trip as part of the plan. Julia said goodbye to him, feeling a tightness in her chest but not knowing why. Hours later, she received the devastating news. Michael had been in a serious car accident and was missing. The car was found in flames, but the body was not there. Julia collapsed upon receiving the news. The ground seemed to disappear beneath her feet, and the pain she felt was unbearable. Sarah was by her side, pretending concern while secretly celebrating the success of her plan. Julia, in her deep grief, never suspected the double betrayal. That night, Julia cried until she had no more tears. She felt empty, destroyed. Sarah's presence by her side was a bitter comfort, but she couldn't imagine the dark truth behind what had happened. The woman she considered her best friend was, in fact, orchestrating her greatest pain. And while Julia struggled to accept Michael's loss, Sarah and he were ready to start their new life, believing they had left all their problems behind. Little did they know that fate had other plans, and that the consequences of their actions would soon catch up with them. Julia couldn't get out of bed the next morning. The emptiness beside her was a constant reminder of the loss. The funeral was torment. Friends and family gathered to offer condolences, but Julia felt like a ghost, disconnected from everyone. With each word of comfort, the pain in her chest only increased. Sarah was by her side the whole time, pretending to be the pillar of strength Julia needed, but in reality, she was feeding off her friend's pain. Days turned into weeks, and Michael's presence continued to haunt Julia. Every corner of the house brought memories of happier times. The sound of his laughter echoed in her mind, a ghost she couldn't exorcise. At night, when everything was silent, Julia cried until sleep finally took her. She felt as if she were being slowly torn apart from the inside. One night, while Julia was trying to find some solace in old photos, Sarah entered the room. "Julia, you need to eat something. You're killing yourself like this." Julia looked at Sarah, her eyes void of hope. "How can I eat, Sarah? How can I live without him?" Sarah approached and hugged her. "I know, dear, but you need to be strong. For him, for yourself." The grief began to affect everything in Julia's life. The company was in shambles, the finances in chaos since Michael's death. Peter tried to help, but his own guilt over the company's financial state prevented him from being effective. Julia began to feel she was fighting a losing battle, a battle that was slowly destroying her. One afternoon, while reviewing company documents, Julia felt a sharp pain in her chest. The anxiety and stress had finally caught up with her. Peter found her unconscious in her office and rushed her to the hospital. There, the doctors said she was suffering from a nervous breakdown. Sarah arrived at the hospital, her expression of concern carefully rehearsed. "Julia, you need to take care of yourself. You can't keep going like this." Julia, weak and vulnerable, held Sarah's hand. "I'm trying, Sarah, but everything seems to be falling apart." Sarah squeezed her hand. "I'm here for you. Always will be." Despite Sarah's superficial support, Julia felt alone in her pain. The house, the company, her own life. Everything seemed out of control. Each day was a struggle just to exist. And in the midst of all this chaos, Sarah's constant presence was both a comfort and a torment. One night, Sarah found Julia sitting on the bedroom floor, surrounded by photos of Michael. "I don't know how to go on, Sarah," said Julia, her voice a broken whisper. Sarah knelt beside her, enveloping her in a hug. "You're stronger than you think, Julia. You'll get through this." But Julia wasn't sure. The pain was too deep, the void left by Michael impossible to fill. Each attempt to move forward felt like walking in quicksand, sinking more with each step. And Sarah, despite her constant presence, couldn't dispel the darkness surrounding Julia. David's behavior, Julia and Michael's 15-year-old son, began to deteriorate rapidly. He was using drugs to cope with the pain, drifting further away from his mother. Julia, in her fragile state, felt powerless to help her son. Each confrontation with David ended in shouting and slammed doors, deepening her despair. One night, after another fight with David, Julia found a farewell letter in his room. Panic gripped her heart as she read her son's words, full of pain and despair. Without thinking twice, she called Sarah, who immediately came to her house. "I can't do this alone, Sarah," Julia said, sobbing. "I'm losing my son too." Sarah held Julia, her words of comfort sharper than blades. "You're not alone, Julia. I'm here. We'll find David and bring him back." The search for David was frantic. Julia felt like she was living an endless nightmare. Every moment of waiting, every second without news was torture. Finally, they found David in a park, drugged and disoriented. Julia hugged him, crying, feeling a mix of relief and despair. Back home, David was put into a rehabilitation program. Julia hoped this would be a new beginning for him. But the battle was just beginning. She felt completely exhausted, emotionally and physically. Each step, the pain seemed to only increase, and she didn't know how much more she could bear. Julia looked at Sarah, who was always around, always offering support. "I don't know what I would do without you, Sarah. Thank you for being here." Sarah smiled, but there was a coldness in her eyes that Julia couldn't see. "I'll always be here for you, Julia. Always." Julia held David's hand while he was in the rehabilitation clinic. His face was pale, his eyes lifeless, and the silence between them was heavy. Julia felt powerless, unable to protect her son from the pain consuming him. Each visit was a new stab to her heart. "You'll get through this, David," Julia said, her voice trembling with emotion. "We'll get through this together." David looked at his mother with empty eyes. "Why did he have to die, Mom? Why did Dad leave us?" Julia felt a wave of despair. She didn't know how to answer that question, didn't know how to explain the inexplicable. "I don't know, honey, but I'm here. I'll never leave you." Days turned into weeks, and David's fight against drugs was a constant battle. Julia felt on the verge of collapse, trying to support her son while dealing with her own pain. Sarah remained present, always offering help, always by Julia's side. But it didn't lessen the sense of emptiness dominating her heart. One afternoon, Julia arrived at the clinic to find David in a group therapy session. She listened from outside, the stories of other young people echoing through the room, each one more painful than the last. And then she heard David's voice. "I feel like I'm alone. My mom is trying, but I lost my dad and it feels like I lost myself too." David's words tore Julia's heart. She blamed herself for not seeing the signs, for not being able to prevent him from falling into drugs. When the session ended, she entered the room, tears streaming down her face. David stood up, and she hugged him with all her strength. "I'm so sorry, David. I'm so sorry. I failed you." David began to cry, his body trembling in his mother's arms. "I just want the pain to go away, Mom. I just want all this to end." Julia held her son, feeling the depth of his pain, the pain that mirrored her own. "We'll find a way, David. Promise. We'll get through this together." The weeks at the clinic dragged on, but slowly, David began to show signs of improvement. Julia was there every day, encouraging, supporting, trying to find strength even when she felt she had none left. And Sarah, always by her side, was the friend Julia thought she needed, not knowing she was the source of so much suffering. One night, after returning from the clinic, Julia found Sarah in the kitchen making tea. "How is he today?" Sarah asked. Julia sighed, sitting at the table. "He's better. But it's so hard, Sarah. Every day is a struggle." Sarah placed a cup of tea in front of Julia. "You're being incredibly strong, Julia. Don't forget that." Julia held the cup, the warmth comforting in her cold hands. "Thank you, Sarah. I don't know what I would do without you." Sarah smiled, but behind her eyes was a coldness that Julia couldn't perceive. "I'll always be here for you, Julia. Always." That night, Julia went to bed feeling a slight relief, but the weight of pain didn't leave her. She closed her eyes, trying to find some peace in sleep, but nightmares haunted her. Michael's image, the guilt over David's condition, everything mixed in a storm of emotions that suffocated her. The next morning, Julia felt an emptiness beside her. She turned, trying to remember Michael's face, the sense of security he brought. But everything seemed so distant now, like a dream slowly fading away. She got up, determined to keep fighting. David needed her, and as hard as it was, she couldn't give up. Each step was an effort, each smile a mask to hide the pain. And even so, she moved forward one day at a time, seeking the hope that seemed so distant. The visits to the clinic continued, and little by little Julia saw small changes in David. He began to smile again, to talk more. Julia clung to these small victories, feeling a spark of hope ignite in her heart. But the road was long and the scars deep. Julia knew the journey was just beginning, and that she would need all the strength possible to continue. She looked at David, her son, and promised herself she would do everything in her power to save him, to save them. While Julia devoted herself to David's recovery and efforts to save the company, Michael and Sarah were in a new city, living a life that should have been of freedom but quickly turned into a nightmare. Michael deeply regretted his choices. The life of a fugitive was lonely and full of uncertainties, and the guilt over what he had left behind weighed more and more. One night, in the small apartment where they were hiding, Michael stared at the ceiling, thoughts swirling in his mind. "What have we done, Sarah?" he whispered, his voice full of anguish. "I left my family behind, left Julia and David. How could I do this?" Sarah tried to reassure him, but her own frustration was beginning to show. "Michael, we did what we had to do. Now we have a chance to start over." Michael turned to her, eyes full of regret. "But at what cost? Julia must be destroyed. And David, he needs me." The tension between them grew each day. Michael felt more and more distant from Sarah, realizing that the promise of a new life was disintegrating. The fights became frequent, and Michael's guilt turned into anger. One night, after a heated argument, Michael left the apartment, needing air. He walked the streets, his mind tormented by the faces of Julia and David. He stopped in a park, sitting on a bench, his head in his hands. The pain was unbearable, the guilt overwhelming. Meanwhile, Julia was at home, trying to put David to bed after a difficult day at the clinic. He had withdrawal crises, moments of despair that made Julia's heart ache. "Everything will be fine, David," she whispered, stroking her son's hair. "I'm here." David, still trembling, held his mother's hand tightly. "I miss Dad, Mom. I miss him so much." Julia felt tears running down her face. "I miss him too, my love. I miss him too." Back in the park, Michael felt lost. The decision to run away now seemed the most foolish of all. He wanted to return, wanted to fix things, but didn't know how. The fear of facing the consequences, the fear of facing Julia and David, paralyzed him. Meanwhile, Sarah was at home, furious. She felt she was losing control over Michael, and that scared her. The perfect plan was falling apart, and the reality of their actions was becoming unbearable. Sarah began to realize she had underestimated the depth of the bond between Michael and his family. Michael returned to the apartment, finding Sarah still awake, a stern expression on her face. "We need to talk," he said, determined. Sarah crossed her arms, trying to stay calm. "About what, Michael?" "About going back. About fixing all this. I need to see Julia and David. They need me." Sarah exploded. "You can't just go back. Everything we've done, this whole escape. You want to throw it all away?" Michael stared at her, feeling anger grow inside him. "Yes, Sarah. Because I realized I made a terrible mistake. My family is everything to me, and I can't keep living like this." Sarah, desperate, tried to convince him. "Michael, you're being irrational. Think about the consequences." But Michael had already made his decision. "I'm going back, Sarah, and if you want to turn me in, go ahead. But I need to fix this." Sarah was silent, defeat evident in her eyes. Michael began packing, determined to correct his mistakes. The journey back would be long and full of uncertainties, but he knew he couldn't keep running. Meanwhile, Julia was at home, trying to deal with the daily routine and David's crises. She didn't know her husband was about to return, didn't know the internal battles he was facing. All she knew was that each day without him was torture, and that she had to be strong for David. Michael's journey back home was full of reflection and regret. Every mile traveled brought a new wave of guilt, but also renewed determination. He needed to face Julia, needed to ask for forgiveness, and above all needed to be the father David deserved. That night, Julia was in the kitchen trying to prepare something to eat. She was tired, emotionally exhausted. Suddenly, she heard a noise at the door. Her heart raced, but she dismissed the sensation, thinking it was just her imagination playing tricks. But then the door opened and there he was. Michael, standing in the doorway, tears in his eyes. "Julia," he said, his voice trembling. Julia froze, unable to believe what she was seeing. "Michael," she whispered, feeling a mix of anger, pain, and relief. Michael took a step towards her, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, Julia. I'm so sorry." Julia felt torn. The pain of betrayal, the joy of seeing him alive, the anger for how he had left. Everything mixed into a storm of emotions. But before she could say anything, David appeared in the hallway, looking at his father with wide eyes. "Dad," he said, his voice full of incredulity. Michael knelt, opening his arms. "Yes, son. Dad is here." David ran into his father's arms, sobbing. Julia watched, tears falling, not knowing how to process it all. The pain, the anger, the love. Everything mixed into a whirlwind. And as Michael hugged his son, Julia felt the magnitude of what was to come. She knew the journey of healing would be long and difficult, full of ups and downs. But in that moment, amidst all the confusion and pain, there was a small flame of hope. The following days were a whirlwind of emotions for Julia. Michael was back, and though this brought temporary relief, it also reopened deep wounds. The pain of betrayal was still fresh, but his presence awakened conflicting feelings of love and anger. Michael was determined to fix things. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to do whatever it took to regain Julia's trust and David's love. "I know I messed up, Julia. I know I hurt you deeply, but I'm here to fight for our family," he said, looking into her eyes. Julia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words. "It will take time, Michael. A long time. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you completely, but I'll try. For David." Michael nodded, feeling the sincerity in her voice. "I'm here, Julia, and I'll prove to you that I'm sorry. Every day, every moment." As Michael tried to reintegrate into the family's life, Julia focused on work and David's recovery. The company was still in crisis, and David's fight against drugs continued. But there were small signs of progress, and that gave Julia the strength she needed to keep going. One night, while they were in the living room, Michael approached Julia. "Can I help with the company? I know I did a lot of harm, but I want to try to help in some way." Julia looked at him, hesitant. "We need all the help we can get. But that doesn't mean everything will be forgotten, Michael. It's a process." Michael began working at the company, trying to correct the mistakes he helped cause. He knew Julia's trust was fragile, and each of his actions needed to show his commitment to the recovery of the company and the family. The nights were long, and the conversations difficult, but Michael was determined. Meanwhile, David continued his struggle at the rehabilitation clinic. Julia and Michael's visits became more frequent, and together, they tried to give David the support he needed. "I'm proud of you, son," Julia would say, holding David's hand. "Every day you fight is a victory." David looked at his parents, feeling a mix of hope and pain. "I want to get better, Mom. I really do." Michael also tried to reconnect with David. "I know I messed up, son, and I know I disappointed you, but I'm here now, and I'll do everything I can to help you." David, though still hurt, began to see his father's effort. "I just want us to be a family again, Dad." The healing journey was slow and full of ups and downs, but each small progress was celebrated. Julia began to see changes in Michael. He was more present, more involved, and that gave her a small hope that maybe with time they could rebuild what was lost. One afternoon, while walking in the park, Michael held Julia's hand. "Thank you for giving me a second chance. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful." Julia looked at him, eyes full of tears. "It's still very difficult, Michael, but I'm trying. For us, for David." And so, day by day, step by step, the family tried to find their way back. The pain was still there, but there was a small flame of hope, a desire to move forward and rebuild. And above all, there was love, a love that, though wounded, still persisted. With time, Michael's presence and Julia's joint effort to save the company began to show results. The finances were stabilizing, and David's recovery was on a promising path. However, the shadow of Sarah's betrayal still loomed over them. Julia couldn't stop thinking about her childhood friend who had betrayed her so deeply. One afternoon, while organizing old documents, she found a box of letters and photos that belonged to Michael. Curiosity got the better of her, and she began to rummage through the papers. Among the letters, Julia found one that stood out. It was a letter from Sarah to Michael written years ago. Sarah's handwriting was unmistakable. Julia began to read, and each word was a blow to her heart. Michael, since we met, I feel something special between us. I know you're married to Julia, but I can no longer hide my feelings. I love you and can't keep pretending I'm just a friend. I know you feel the same. We can't keep living this lie. With love, Sarah. Julia felt as if the ground were opening beneath her feet. Her hands trembled as she held the letter. The betrayal was deeper than she had imagined. Sarah, her childhood friend, had been involved with Michael for years. The shock and pain hit her hard. That night, Julia confronted Sarah. I found a letter from you to Michael, she said, her voice trembling. Were you having an affair with him all this time? Sarah tried to deny it, but the evidence was irrefutable. Julia, I can explain. Julia felt the anger and pain bubbling inside her. Explain? You destroyed my family, Sarah. Pretended to be my friend while betraying me behind my back. Sarah tried to approach, but Julia took a step back. Don't come near me. I trusted you and you stabbed me in the back. Sarah, desperate, tried to justify her actions. I never meant to hurt you, Julia. I loved Michael, but I also care about you. Julia felt a wave of disdain. You don't know what love is, Sarah. You destroyed everything I loved. Get out of my house. Now. Sarah left the house and Julia fell to her knees, crying uncontrollably. The pain of betrayal was unbearable. She felt as if her life was falling apart again. The loss of Michael, David's struggle, and now her best friend's betrayal. It all seemed too much to bear. Meanwhile, Michael felt the weight of his actions more and more. He knew the choice to run away with Sarah had been a mistake, but the guilt and fear kept him from returning. He spent sleepless nights thinking about Julia and David, wishing he could fix things. One night, while alone in the apartment, Michael found Sarah's diary. Curious and seeking answers, he began to read. Each page revealed more about Sarah's manipulation, about how she had planned everything from the beginning. I knew Michael was vulnerable. I used that to my advantage. He needed someone to run away with, and I was there for him. Julia never suspected anything. Now we have a new life, but sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing. Michael felt a wave of disgust. He realized how much he had been manipulated, how much Sarah had influenced his decisions. The anger grew inside him, but also a determination. He needed to return, needed to correct his mistakes. While Michael made this decision, Julia was at the hospital beside David, who had suffered a severe relapse. She held his hand, praying he would pull through. Please, David, stay with me. I can't lose you too. David opened his eyes, weak but conscious. Mom, I'll fight. For you. For us. Julia felt a wave of hope. We'll get through this together, my love. I promise. While Julia struggled to stay afloat after the devastating discovery of Sarah's betrayal, Sarah's life was also falling apart. Expelled from Julia's house, she found herself alone, dealing with the consequences of her actions. Michael, after reading the diary and realizing Sarah's manipulation, confronted her with a coldness she had never seen in him. How could you do this? Michael shouted, throwing the diary on the table between them. You planned everything, used my weaknesses against me. I trusted you, Sarah. Sarah, with tears in her eyes, tried to defend herself. Michael, I did it for us. I thought we were building a new life together. Michael shook his head, full of regret. This isn't life, Sarah. We destroyed Julia and David's lives. I destroyed my own family. Michael's anger turned into a firm decision. I'm leaving. I need to fix things if there's still anything to fix. Sarah tried to stop Michael from leaving, but he was determined. "Michael, please. Don't leave me. I love you." Michael looked at her, eyes full of pain. "You don't know what love is, Sarah. I need to do what's right." Michael left the apartment while Sarah fell to her knees crying. She was alone, her manipulation and lies finally catching up with her. Meanwhile, Michael began his journey back home, each mile increasing his determination to fix past mistakes. Back at the hospital, Julia was beside David, holding his hand as he fought to recover from the relapse. "You're strong, David. I know you can do it," she said, her voice full of hope and pain. David looked at his mother, eyes full of tears. "I want to get better, Mom. For you. For us." Julia kissed his forehead, feeling a wave of love and determination. "We'll get through this together. I promise." While Julia cared for David, she received an unexpected call from Michael. His voice was full of regret. "Julia, I'm coming back home. I need to see you and David. I need to fix things." Julia felt a mix of emotions, anger, pain, but also a glimmer of hope. "Michael, you abandoned us, left us at the most difficult moment." Michael swallowed hard, the pain evident in his voice. "I know, Julia, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to fix it. I'm so sorry." Julia closed her eyes, fighting back tears. "David is fighting against drugs. He needs you, but he also needs you to understand how much you hurt us." Michael promised he would do everything to repair the damage caused. "I'll be there soon. Please let me try." Julia hung up, feeling overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. She wanted to believe Michael was truly sorry, but the pain of betrayal was still too deep. Meanwhile, Sarah was alone in her apartment, dealing with the void and guilt. Without Michael and Julia, she realized her manipulations had left her completely alone. Each moment of solitude was a reminder of her choices and the lives she had destroyed. One afternoon, Sarah decided to seek professional help. She knew she needed to deal with her own demons, understand why she had done what she did. Sitting in the waiting room of a therapist, she reflected on her actions, feeling deep shame and regret. While Sarah tried to rebuild her life, Michael arrived in the city. He drove to the house he once shared with Julia and David. Standing in front of the door, he felt a wave of fear and regret. He took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. Julia opened the door, her heart racing. When she saw Michael, eyes full of tears, she felt a mix of love and pain. "Michael!" He interrupted her, holding her hands. "Julia, I know I can't undo what I did, but I'm here to ask for forgiveness and to fight for our family." Julia looked at him, emotions running high. "You left us at the most difficult moment of our lives. How do you expect me to just forgive that?" Michael swallowed hard, the pain evident in his eyes. "I know, Julia, and I'll fight every day to try to repair what I did. Even if I never get your forgiveness, I'll keep trying." Julia closed the door, leaving Michael outside, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. She knew the journey ahead would be difficult, full of challenges, but she was determined to move forward, focused on David and rebuilding her own life. As Michael walked away, determined to do whatever he could to help Julia and David, he knew his redemption wouldn't be easy. He was willing to face anything to try to regain the trust and love of his family, even if it meant accepting he might never be fully forgiven. Days turned into weeks since Michael tried to reconcile with Julia. She focused on helping David recover and keeping the company afloat. The nights were lonely, and the weight of responsibility seemed to crush her more and more. One afternoon, Julia was at the hospital with David, attending another therapy session. David's recovery was slow, but each small progress was a victory. While waiting in the waiting room, her phone rang. It was an unexpected call from a hospital in another city. "Mrs. Julia? We have a patient here who asked to see you. He says he's your husband, Michael." Julia was stunned. What was Michael doing in a hospital in another city? Her heart raced. I'll be there as soon as possible," she replied, trying to control her trembling voice. On the way to the hospital, Julia felt a mix of emotions: anger, pain, worry. Upon arrival, she was led to a room where she found Michael, lying in bed, pale and weak. He looked like he had aged years since she last saw him. "Michael," she said, trying to hide the mix of anger and compassion she felt. Michael opened his eyes, the pain evident in his gaze. "Julia, thank you for coming," he said, his voice weak. "I wanted to see you. Wanted to apologize." Julia held back the tears, fighting against the tide of emotions. "You left me, Michael. Left me to deal with everything. Why now?" Michael took a deep breath, guilt weighing in every word. "I know I can't undo what I did. I know I hurt you more than I can imagine. But I wanted you to know that I regret everything. And that despite everything, I love you." Julia felt the tears fall, finally allowing herself to feel the pain she had been trying to hide. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Michael. The pain is too deep." Michael extended a trembling hand, and Julia, hesitant, held it. "I understand, Julia, and I accept that. I just wanted you to know that in the end I realized how wrong I was, and how much you and David mean to me." Julia stayed by his side, holding his hand, tears falling freely. "David is fighting. He needs me, and I need to be strong for him." Michael looked at Julia, eyes full of remorse. "I know, and I'm sorry for not being there for him. But you're the strongest person I know, Julia. I know you'll make it." Julia spent hours by Michael's side, talking, crying, remembering the good and bad moments. She felt a mix of relief and sadness, knowing this might be the end. Michael seemed weaker by the minute, and she knew he didn't have much time. As day turned to night, Michael held Julia's hand tightly one last time. "I love you, Julia. Always have." Julia leaned down, kissing his forehead. "I loved you too, Michael. And despite everything, a part of me always will." Michael took one last breath, and his hand relaxed in Julia's. She felt the weight of loss once again. But this time there was a sense of closure, of a cycle finally closing. Julia returned home, feeling emotionally exhausted. She told David about Michael's death, and they cried together, feeling the loss and pain, but also a silent relief that Michael's struggle was over. In the following days, Julia found the strength to keep going. Michael's death brought a new determination to fight for David and the company. She knew the road ahead would still be difficult, but she was ready to face it with the strength and love that had always guided her. In the days following Michael's death, Julia found herself confronted with a mix of emotions. There was sadness, of course, but also a certain relief and renewed determination to move forward for David. Grief was a solitary process, but each tear shed seemed to bring a bit more strength to her. Julia was in the office trying to organize the paperwork when she received an unexpected visit. Sarah walked into the room looking worn and regretful. "Julia, we need to talk." Julia felt a wave of anger and pain upon seeing the woman she once considered her best friend. "What are you doing here, Sarah?" Sarah approached, eyes full of tears. "I know I messed up, Julia. I know I betrayed you in the worst possible way. But I need to ask for your forgiveness." Julia crossed her arms, trying to stay calm. "Forgiveness, Sarah? After everything you did? You destroyed my family, manipulated Michael, and betrayed me. How do you expect me to forgive you?" Sarah fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "I know, Julia. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm trying to change, trying to understand why I did what I did. I just wanted you to know that." Julia felt a mix of compassion and repulsion. "Change, Sarah? That doesn't change what you did. It doesn't bring Michael back. Doesn't erase the pain you caused me and David." Sarah sobbed, looking like a ghost of her former self. "I know, Julia. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry. That I'm truly sorry." Julia slowly approached, looking into Sarah's eyes. "Regret doesn't fix everything, Sarah, but maybe it's a start. Only time will tell if you've really changed." Sarah stood up, still crying, and Julia opened the door for her. "I need to take care of my son and the company. I can't look back anymore. Good luck, Sarah. I hope you find the peace you're looking for." Sarah left, leaving Julia alone with her thoughts. She felt a certain relief in finally confronting Sarah, but the pain was still there, a constant presence in her life. Back at the hospital, David was making progress in rehabilitation. Each day was a struggle, but he was determined to get better. Julia was by his side, encouraging him, even when everything seemed difficult. One afternoon, while they were talking in the clinic garden, David looked at his mother, eyes full of tears. "Mom, do you think you'll ever be able to forgive Dad?" Julia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the question. "I don't know, David. What he did was very painful, but I think with time we can find a way to move forward. I don't know if it's forgiveness, but it's a start." David held his mother's hand, feeling her strength transfer to him. "I just want us to be happy again, Mom." Julia smiled, tears streaming down her face. "We will, David. We'll find our way back to happiness. Together." As the days passed, Julia and David began to find a new rhythm of life. The scars were still there, but the love and determination to move forward were stronger. Julia knew the journey was still long, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a true hope for the future. With the passing months, Julia and David's lives began to stabilize. The company was recovering, and David showed signs of solid recovery. Julia, although still carrying the scars of the past, felt a new strength growing within her. Each day, Julia found small reasons to smile. Her relationship with David was stronger than ever, and each victory, no matter how small, was celebrated. She knew the recovery journey was long and full of challenges, but she was determined to move forward. One afternoon, while walking in the park, David looked at his mother, a shy smile on his lips. "Thanks for not giving up on me, Mom." Julia smiled, feeling a wave of emotion. "I would never give up on you, David. You're my world." David hugged his mother, feeling her strength transfer to him. "I love you, Mom, and I promise I'll keep fighting for both of us." Julia felt tears streaming down her face, but this time they were tears of joy. "I love you too, David, and together we'll overcome anything." As the sun set, illuminating the park with a golden glow, Julia felt an inner peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. She knew the road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt true hope for the future. And so Julia and David moved forward, day by day strengthening each other and finding new reasons to smile. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer defined them. They had found the strength to overcome the challenges and build a new life together, based on love, hope, and the determination to move forward.